I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
I remember that night not for any grand significance, but for its smallness, the way the river gathered light as if reluctant to let the day go. The chair well lay black and patient under the drooping willows. Students drifted past on narrow punts, their laughter rising like the faint echo of a bell from some forgotten chapel. Someone had strung paper lanterns along the bank. They trembled in the damp air, casting pale ovals onto water slick with pollen. From somewhere downstream, a boatman hummed what might have been Schubert, though the melody sagged and stumbled, and I caught myself silently correcting the phrase, a habit that had become second nature. I had left the opera early. The conductor's tempo in the final act had been hurried, the soprano's high notes brittle. My glass of interval whiskey had tasted tired. Everything that evening had seemed fractionally out of tune, like a painting hung crooked on a gallery wall. So I walked. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the towpath with the glistening sheen of slate. My shoes darkened at the edges with each step. The smell was of wet paper and moss, of wood rubbed smooth by generations of oars. Across the water, the college windows glowed weakly, squares of yellow dimmed by old leaded glass. A door closed somewhere with the muffled dignity peculiar to old buildings. The sound of the river's slow eddies lapping against stone joined the boatman's faltering Schubert. I found myself counting the strokes in his rhythm, noticing where he hesitated before the minor turn, and thought, not for the first time, how much of life consists of misremembered music. I paused at the boathouse belonging to St. Gabriel's. Its timbers were dark with rain, the brass lock dulled, the padstone cracked. Inside, I could just make out the shapes of oars, stacked like skeletal wings, and a pair of cracked leather shoes abandoned beneath a bench. A clock hung above the door, its hands stiff at 12. The sight caught me with a small, unnecessary tug. Midnight had not yet arrived. My own watch showed 23 minutes past 11. Yet here was this clock, already suspended at the next day, as if anticipating some event it alone could foretell. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the muted splash of a pole pushing against mud. My mind drifted to the crossword in my pocket, unfinished. One clue had troubled me all evening. Silent 12. I had penciled in hush at first, then erased it. Now, standing before the frozen hands of the boathouse clock, the words rearranged themselves, though without solution. I tucked the paper away. Some things need the patience of mourning. The path narrowed past the college garden. Honeysuckle climbed the stone wall, its scent faint in the cool air. My thoughts, as ever, veered toward the quiet center of the case I was not yet investigating. The unfathomable sadness of missteps, mine and others. I had no reason then to connect the stopped clock to anything larger than the long-maintenance indifference of a bursar's office. Still, the image lodged itself. Students' laughter drifted again, then faded. The river widened into a stretch where mist formed like breath. My footsteps slowed. In the far distance, a bell struck the quarter hour, dull and heavy, a sound too old to be hurried. I thought of going back to my flat, of whiskey poured without ice, of the crossword waiting to yield. Instead, I lingered on the towpath, watching the last punt turn under the bridge, its lantern reflected twice, then broken. There are nights when Oxford seems less a city than a rehearsal of memories. You walk through it knowing you are being observed by ghosts, scholars, lovers, failures, and you try not to look back. That night was one of them. I left the boathouse behind and walked on, but the image of the clock followed me, still and accusing, its hands poised at a time the world had not yet reached. Some part of me, though I could not name it, had already begun to listen. The morning after the river still smelt of willow bark and wet iron. My flat, by contrast, was stale with old books and the residue of whiskey. Lewis arrived just after 8, carrying a folded newspaper like a reluctant messenger. He placed it on the small oak table where my unfinished crossword lay, and told me, in that cautious voice he used for delicate news, that there had been a death at St. Gabriel's. I unfolded the paper. Beneath a photograph of the college gates, as unyielding as a fortress, ran the small headline, "Junior Bursar found dead. Edmund Kerridge. Heart failure at midnight." The brief paragraph added only that he was known for his scrupulous handling of accounts and his fondness for quoting minor poets at high table. The article's concision irritated me. Kerridge had been reduced to a profession and a habit of verse. Yet the detail about the watch, stopped precisely at midnight, was not in print. That had come from Lewis, whose eyes, I noticed, flickered toward my half-empty glass as though measuring my night. I asked him when he'd last been inside St. Gabriel's. "Not for years," he said, though he recalled the bursar as a tall, bird-like man with immaculate handwriting. I remembered him differently. A figure glimpsed once in the Bodleian, tracing a finger along the spines of ledgers, lips moving silently as though reciting something only he could hear. The memory might have been invention, but it lodged with a peculiar insistence. The paper smelt faintly of ink and damp. I held it close, scanning the tiny type for omissions. A single name surfaced in the obituary section, someone else entirely. And yet I paused, thinking of the crossword from the night before. Silent 12. The clue had mocked me, resisting solution. Now, with the image of Kerridge's frozen watch in my mind, the words rearranged themselves. Hush at midnight, 12 struck but unheard. Not a solution, merely an echo, but enough to sharpen my interest. Lewis shifted his weight. He said the college doctor had been quick to certify a heart attack. Natural causes. No sign of struggle. But he hesitated before adding that the port bottle on Kerridge's desk had been full only the day before and now sat nearly empty. He supposed grief or loneliness might make a man drink. His phrasing, grief or loneliness, lingered between us like an unacknowledged guest. I rose, poured coffee, and felt the faint tremor in my fingers that comes of too little sleep. Oxford's bells began their uneven chorus outside, announcing an hour I did not want. I asked Lewis to fetch the file on St. Gabriel's finances. He looked surprised. We hadn't been asked to investigate, but he knew me well enough not to argue. As he left, the corridor outside my door exhaled its usual draught of cold air. I sat down again, staring at the crossword. The clue remained blank, but the ink from my pencil had ghosted through to the next page, forming a pale mirror of the unsolved word. That seemed apt. I thought of Kerridge at midnight, alone with his port, the stopped watch like a small rebellion against time. The heart can fail without warning, but watches seldom stop without a cause. I told myself it was none of my business, yet already the case had begun to arrange itself in my mind, like a familiar piece of music played too slowly. The notes might be wrong, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Through the window I could see Magdalen Tower glistening with rain, a grey heron lifting off from the meadow. The city moved on, students hurrying to lectures, vans delivering bread, bells marking quarter hours that cared nothing for a dead bursar. Still I lingered over the clipping, tracing the outline of the photograph with a thumb as though the stone gates might open and tell me what lay inside. I finished my coffee cold. The crossword remained unsolved. But somewhere between the misquoted poets and the port wine, a pattern had begun to whisper, and I, as ever, found myself listening. The rain had thinned to a mist by the time Lewis and I passed beneath St. Gabriel's gate. The ironwork was blackened and cold, its curves echoing the monastic severity of the stone. Inside, the college closed around us like a held breath. Courtyards lay hushed under ivy, in the faint drip of water from carved gargoyles. Even the sparrows seemed deferential, hopping only along the edges of the worn flagstones. I caught the smell of damp paper and old wax polish rising from the stairwells and felt, not for the first time, that Oxford had a gift for turning its buildings into confidences. Lewis moved a step behind me, notebook already out, though he looked up at the architecture as if it might deliver the facts before the people did. We climbed a shallow flight of stairs whose treads had been hollowed by centuries of deliberate pacing. The corridor at the top offered that particular mixture of library and crypt, creaking boards, a single bare bulb, swaying from a wire, shelves lined with records no one had touched for decades. Dr. Sylvia March waited for us in an office lined with pale wood and photographs of rowing crews. Her hair, silvered but disciplined, caught the light from a narrow window. She gestured to two low chairs and remarked, almost cheerfully, that St. Gabriel's was not accustomed to police visits. Her voice had the mild edge of someone well aware of her institution's place in the hierarchy of colleges. When she spoke of Kerridge, she used phrases like steady hand and unobtrusive presence, as though describing a piece of reliable furniture. Yet her fingers traced the edge of a paper knife while she talked, a motion she seemed not to notice. I asked about the college accounts. She offered a small, amused lift of her eyebrows. Audited annually, she said, nothing irregular. Then, quoting Hardy inexactly, she murmured something about the blighting of young lives. The misquotation caught my ear, but I let it pass. People reveal more when their errors are left to settle. We found Lionel Fane in the senior common room, leaning against the mantel as if posing for a portrait. His tie was loose, his smile impeccable, but the skin under his eyes showed the grey of restless nights. He spoke of Kerridge with affectionate disdain, calling him a custodian of dusty numbers. When I asked about his own finances, he performed a little shrug that might have been continental charm or deflection. A phrase escaped him, "The wheel must turn," and he misattributed it to Horace. I noted it privately. Margaret Elstow met us in the library. The smell there was intoxicating. Paper softened by time, polish, a trace of mildew near the upper shelves. She wore a plain cardigan, her hair gathered loosely, and for a moment the years fell away to when she had studied Schubert with me at the music faculty. She greeted me with the careful warmth of someone unsure how much memory to acknowledge. Her answers about Kerridge were precise but bloodless. She had catalogued several of his donations, she said, but found him unremarkable otherwise. Yet when she bent to replace a volume, her hand lingered on the spine of a thin book of poems, and I glimpsed in the margin a note in Kerridge's handwriting correcting a line. Theo Crane required more searching. We found him in a small room above the chapel, curtains drawn despite the pale afternoon. His classics notes sprawled across the desk in crabbed Latin. He looked up with mild irritation, as though we had interrupted a ritual. His words about Kerridge were measured, almost formal. He spoke of integrity, of an unyielding sense of order. He also remarked, unprompted, that no one could prove a man's motives from ledgers alone. Another misquoted poet, another faint chink of something rehearsed. Each of them gave us polished evasions, words burnished by repetition. But under the varnish of civility, I felt a small discordant chord beginning to vibrate. The Hardy lines, altered, the Horace misattributed, the marginalia in the book of poems. All scraps of some coded conversation still hidden. As we left the library, a draught moved through the cloister, carrying the scent of wet stone and a distant echo of footsteps. For a moment I had the uncanny sense that the college itself was listening, waiting for the right question to be asked. The afternoon had that suspended quality Oxford sometimes wears, a pause between showers where the air holds both damp and dust. The library at St. Gabriel's smelled of its long custody, paper soft as cloth, floorboards rubbed hollow, a faint trace of coal smoke from some forgotten fireplace. Margaret had arranged tea on a narrow table between two high-backed chairs, the kind designed for solitary reading rather than conversation. Her movements were careful, not timid but exacting, as though each gesture were a note in a score she preferred to keep unbroken. She asked lightly if I still listened to Schubert when it rained. I told her the habit had never left me. She smiled without meeting my eyes. The tea was strong and dark, with a faint bitterness of overbrewed leaves. It suited the place. We spoke at first of small things. The college choir's recent repertoire, a book she had catalogued on medieval almsgiving, words that circled the subject rather than entering it. All the while, I felt the presence of Kerridge, like an unopened letter at the edge of a desk. On the table lay the visitor's book, a heavy volume bound in cracked green leather. Margaret turned it idly while talking of student borrowing privileges. Her fingers stopped at a page from the previous week. Without meaning to read, I caught a line written in a neat, angular hand. "The lads in their hundreds." It was attributed to Houseman, but the words had been altered. Some small inflection, a verb changed, a cadence misstepped. I had seen the very form corrected in Kerridge's recent article on minor textual variants. Margaret noticed my pause. She asked if something was wrong. "Nothing," I said, but my mind was already elsewhere, testing the alteration like a cipher. Why would someone copy a known misquotation unless it meant something to those who recognized it? The page above bore a different name, one of the junior fellows. The sequence of signatures could be coincidence, yet as I traced them with my thumb, I felt the faint thrill of a pattern beginning to show itself. Margaret poured more tea. She remarked that Kerridge had been in the library late several nights before his death, checking reference works on 19th century trusts. I asked, as casually as I could, about an old endowment fund I had glimpsed in the accounts. She tilted her head, then answered that such funds were common but often hedged about with conditions no one now remembered. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes drifted toward a locked cabinet near the window. The gesture was small, perhaps unconscious, yet it pricked my attention. I let the silence lengthen. Outside, rain began again, pattering against leaded glass with the muffled rhythm of a metronome. Somewhere in the upper gallery, a student closed a book. The echo fell down like dust. Margaret said softly that Kerridge had kept a private diary, mostly about college matters, but that it was no longer in its usual place. She seemed unsure whether to call it lost or removed. Her voice, when she said removed, was almost imperceptibly lower. I lifted the visitor's book once more. Beneath the misquoted Houseman line, someone had drawn a faint mark, a diagonal slash no librarian would tolerate. It could have been an accident, but it lined up precisely with the margin of a previous entry. My pencil traced it as though solving a crossword clue. Silent 12, I thought, the riddle from my newspaper. 2 words, 2 lines altered, 2 funds perhaps. Not an answer, only a glimmer. But glimmers have their own gravity. Margaret asked if I would stay for another cup. I declined, saying only that I had appointments elsewhere. She looked relieved and sad at once, as if the conversation had skirted an edge neither of us wished to cross. As I left, the smell of paper and rain clung to my coat. Down the corridor, the creak of the boards under my feet sounded like a question repeated too often. I knew then that the case had slipped beyond the merely administrative. Something older, coded and patient, was waiting to be uncovered, and that I, unwillingly, had begun to listen. The day had turned to a grey smear by the time Lewis returned with the figures. Rain slanted across my window, making the college roofs look like charcoal sketches blurred by a wet thumb. He placed the photocopies on my desk without ceremony and said there were gaps in the bursary accounts. Small ones at first, then larger, irregular as missing teeth. His voice carried that mixture of curiosity and distaste he reserved for petty deceit. I skimmed the columns of numbers, their neatness failing to disguise the absences. On one page, a date caught my eye, 12th of the month, payment deferred. Another entry mirrored it exactly on a different ledger. Silent 12. The phrase from last night's crossword rose like a whisper from the paper. I told Lewis to leave the files with me. He hesitated, then remarked that the warden would want a discreet conversation soon. He left with his usual careful tread, his coat collar turned up like a man crossing an uncertain border. The door closed softly, and I was alone again with the rain and the smell of damp paper. Later, in a public house off St. Aldatis, I unfolded the crossword on the scarred wooden table. A single pint stood before me, warm at the edges, its head already settled. The room was low-ceilinged, the beams dark with centuries of breath. A clock behind the bar ticked louder than it needed to. Around me, the few patrons spoke in murmurs, their words rising and falling like a tide just beyond the ear. The crossword's clue sat where I had left it. Silent 12. I wrote and erased hush, mute, even toll. None satisfied. My pencil hovered while my other hand traced the condensation on the glass. Numbers in the bursary ledger repeated in pairs, always on the 12th. Some deferred, some doubled. A rhythm, not a mistake. But whose rhythm and for what? I sipped the beer and felt its thin bitterness. Margaret drifted into my mind without invitation. Her voice in the library, careful but distant, like a song played from another room. I remembered the way her eyes slid toward the locked cabinet when I asked about endowments. Not guilt, perhaps. Maybe just the reflex of someone guarding a secret she did not entirely understand. The thought unsettled me. I had hoped, absurdly, for an ally in her, some echo of our shared past. Instead, there was only the coolness of her smile and the faint scent of her cardigan as she poured tea. The pub's fire crackled low, throwing up a smell of scorched oak. I looked again at the clue. Silent 12. In music, a rest. In time, a date. In finances, perhaps a code. The bursary entries like tied notes in a score, unseen but audible to one who knows the melody. I jotted a question mark next to the clue, folded the paper, and stared at the dark wood of the table until the grain blurred into rivers. Outside, evening thickened. The street lamps glowed with a wet halo. Students hurried past the window, their laughter muffled by the glass. My reflection in the pane looked older than I felt, a man held between two unsolved puzzles, a dead bursar's stopped watch and a woman's guarded eyes. I finished the pint slowly, each swallow a small concession. The crossword remained unsolved, yet something, a pressure behind the eyes, a half-formed cadence, told me that the two puzzles were one and the same piece of music, still waiting for its true tempo. I left the pub without a word, the folded newspaper in my pocket like an unopened letter, and walked back into the rain. It was Lewis who first said that Lionel Fane looked good for it. The fellow had the right mixture of charm and desperation, a scholar who dressed like an advertisement for inherited ease but whose accounts told another story. Gambling debts, whispered loans from students, a tendency to appear at doors after midnight with papers in his hand. Kerridge's rooms had seen him more than once. Even the porters had remarked on a quarrel about numbers that didn't add up. It all fitted so neatly that I distrusted it from the beginning. Neatness is rarely honest. We left Oxford at dusk, the city behind us dissolving into a smear of lamps and rain. Lewis drove, his fingers drumming lightly on the wheel. He rehearsed the case aloud, lining up facts like pawns on a board. I listened without answering, my eyes on the hedgerows sliding past, dark and close. Somewhere in my coat pocket lay the crossword, still unsolved, Silent 12, mocking me with its blank squares. The road narrowed, twisting between fields that smelled of wet straw and diesel. We passed a chapel whose windows leaked a faint orange glow, then a row of cottages where no one stood at the curtains. Lewis asked what I really thought of Fane. I told him the debts were real enough, the late visits undeniable, But motive is a more delicate instrument than opportunity. He grunted, dissatisfied. He liked the clean weight of evidence in his hands. The inn lay at the end of a lane lined with hawthorn, its sign swinging weakly in the wind. A low building with peeling paint, 2 windows lit, 1 shuttered. We parked under a dripping tree. My shoes sank slightly into the gravel, the stones giving a faint crunch like paper underfoot. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of beer, damp wool, and something sweet. Perhaps applewood burning in the grate. We found Fane in a corner booth, not alone. Across from him sat a woman I did not recognize. Her coat draped over the bench as if she had arrived in haste. She had that calmness of someone used to secrecy. Fane looked up with a flicker of irritation, then rearranged his face into his habitual smile. He introduced her as a friend from Cambridge who preferred anonymity. The words were chosen with care, but his hand on hers was uncalculated, tender, a gesture rehearsed only by intimacy. Lewis asked where Fane had been at midnight on the night Kerridge died. Fane said simply that he had been here with her. The innkeeper confirmed it without enthusiasm, producing a register with their name scrawled in a hurry. The handwriting was unmistakably Fane's, but what held me was the hour, 11:47 p.m. They had arrived before midnight, ordered 2 whiskies, stayed until the small hours. The entry was smudged at the corner, as if the pen had been lifted in haste. I looked at the woman. She met my eyes without fear, then turned slightly toward Fane, a movement almost imperceptible, like a compass needle aligning. She said nothing. In that silence, I felt the first faint crack in our neat theory. Back in the car, rain tapping on the roof like fingers, Lewis muttered that the alibi was solid. I agreed. The ledger at the inn was plain, the staff unshaken, the timing incompatible with murder. Yet something in the smudged register tugged at me. A diagonal mark crossing the margin, no more than a slip of ink, but echoing the slash I had seen beneath the misquoted poet in the visitor's book. Coincidence, perhaps. Still, as I traced it later with my finger, the pattern flickered again at the edge of sense. The drive back was silent. Oxford's spires emerged from mist like the tips of submerged ruins. In my mind, the case had stalled. The pieces refused to arrange themselves. Fane, with his debts and quarrels, had been a tempting solution, but temptation is not truth. Beside me, Lewis stared at the road, the wipers sweeping away rain only for it to return. That night, I sat alone with the crossword, the pint untouched. Silent, 12 remained unsolved. In the margin, I wrote 2 initials without thinking. They did not belong to Fane. I stared at them until the letters blurred, the pub's clock ticking toward midnight, and felt the case slip deeper into shadow. The morning was brittle with frost when Lewis came to find me. His breath hung in the corridor outside my office like a pale question mark. He said a boy from the chapel choir had asked for him by name and would I come, because the boy was frightened. We walked across the quad in silence. The grass crackled underfoot. Above us, the stonework dripped slow beads of thawed ice. The choir loft smelled of candle grease, and old wood rubbed smooth by hands, not yet grown large. A pale light slanted through the high window, catching the gilt edges of hymnals stacked like neglected chess pieces. The chorister stood near the rail, clutching his cap. He spoke in a rush to Lewis, then faltered when he saw me listening. He said, low, as if the organ pipes themselves might repeat it, that he had been in the corridor outside Kerridge's rooms on the night of his death, practicing a Latin declamation for some school exercise. He had seen Margaret Elstow slip inside carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She had not stayed long. The boy had thought it odd only because she glanced up and down the passage before unlocking the door. Lewis's face took on that look of reluctant satisfaction. He said this was what we'd been waiting for. I asked the boy to describe the parcel. He said it was narrow, like music or perhaps a box of sweets. His hands mimed the shape without thinking. A musician's gesture, not a liar's. I thanked him and sent him back to his practice, promising nothing would rebound upon him. His footsteps faded down the stairwell, leaving only the faint echo of his Latin, a ghost of sound among the pipes. I remained by the rail a moment longer. Through the chancel screen below, Margaret was moving along the shelves of the music library, her head inclined as though listening to something private. That small parcel in the boy's story burned like a coal in my mind. Blackmail, I thought, or a last attempt at reconciliation with Kerridge. The thought came sharp and unwelcome. Jealousy in a man who has no right to it. Later, in a small reading room off the cloister, Margaret agreed to see me. The air smelt of damp velvet and tea long gone cold. She sat opposite, hands folded on her lap. When I asked about the parcel, she did not flinch. She said it was a set of rare music scores Kerridge had promised to appraise. She had found them in a library sale and wanted his opinion before making a donation to the college. Her tone was steady, her eyes clear but guarded. I asked which scores. She named them with a precision only a musician would possess. Her story was internally consistent, the details exact but unshowy, as if rehearsed for herself alone. I watched her fingers, pale against the dark fabric, and thought how easily guilt and innocence can mimic one another. When she left, I remained in the chair, tracing a small water stain on the armrest. A single sheet of music lay on the table, a photocopy of some psalm tune. In the margin, a note in Kerridge's handwriting corrected a misprinted bar. The ink had smudged into a shape like a question mark. I wrote it down beside the crossword clue still gnawing at me. Silent 12. Another echo. Another fragment. Outside the reading room, the cloister creaked under shifting wind. Bells from a distant tower marked the half-hour, their sound muffled by stone. The case had gathered a new thread only to have it slip through my fingers. Margaret's explanation might be true. It might not. Either way, I was left with the smell of candle wax, the boy's nervous voice, and the image of her turning a key in a door she was not supposed to open. I walked back across the quad as dusk began to settle, the frost returning in a thin glitter. Students passed without looking up, their scarves drawn tight. In my pocket, the crossword remained folded, unsolved, its blank squares like windows in a dark building. The afternoon light in Theo Crane's room had the color of weak tea left too long to cool. Curtains half drawn, the air faintly bitter with pipe smoke and neglected ink. He sat at his desk surrounded by papers whose edges curled like autumn leaves. For a while, he tried to keep his voice level, rehearsing the usual platitudes about collegial loyalty, but the pauses between his words grew longer until they no longer formed a defense. Under the thin veneer of Latin quotations lay a tremor, and at last it surfaced. He said Kerridge had come to him in confidence, muttering about a scheme he called the watch. Not a timepiece, but a fund hidden in the folds of college accounting, used to pay hush money to staff who had been dismissed with reasons best unrecorded. A tradition older than either of them, Crane claimed, inherited like the silverware. Kerridge, with his meticulous conscience, had been threatening to expose it. Crane's fingers tapped the desk in a rhythm that might have been nervousness or some internal metronome. He insisted he had tried to dissuade him, that he had no wish to see the college dragged through scandal. I watched his hands more than his face. One finger bore an ink stain shaped like a crescent, fresh enough to have been earned that morning. A small deduction flickered. Crane had been copying something recently, perhaps hurriedly. His eyes avoided mine, sliding to a shelf where ledgers stood like sentries. He said nothing more. The confession stopped short, a wire cut mid-current. Later, Lewis and I went to the bursar's office. The college safe lay behind a panel of oak, its brass handle cold to the touch. The clerk produced Kerridge's diary with the air of someone handing over a relic, not a record. A modest volume bound in black cloth, pages lined with neat entries. Appointments, minor purchases, cryptic notations of meetings in Latin tags. The smell of it was a mixture of dust and candle wax, as though it had been kept near a chapel rather than an office. I turned the pages slowly, hearing in my head the dry whisper of Kerridge's voice. Meetings with fellows, adjustments to bursaries, a remark about misquoted poets that might have been a private joke. Then the entries drew closer to the day of his death. His handwriting grew tighter, as if the nib had been pressed harder into the paper. On the final date, the lines broke off abruptly. A whole page had been torn out, not neatly removed, but wrenched, leaving a ragged edge like a torn wing. It was the page that should have covered the night he died. Lewis muttered that someone must have wanted it gone. I said nothing, tracing the fibers at the margin with my thumb. A faint impression of writing remained on the verso, a ghost of words pressed through. I held it to the light, but only saw fragments. A date, a half-line about the watch, and something that might have been a name or simply a stroke of the pen. My pencil hovered, copying the fragments onto a scrap of paper. Back in my room, the rain had returned, striking the window in irregular beats. The crossword lay open on the desk. Silent 12 still unsolved, but the missing diary page echoed it in some private way. Hush at midnight, a watch, both timepiece and conspiracy, a date deferred again and again. Patterns rose like bubbles, only to burst before reaching the surface. I poured a measure of whiskey and let it sit untouched. Margaret's face drifted into my mind, then Fane's careless smile, then Crane's ink-stained finger. Each detail separate, yet forming a chord I could not yet hear. I wrote the word watch at the top of the page, drew a line beneath it, then the numbers of the bursary irregularities. 12, 12, 12. Outside, the bells marked the hour with a muffled clang. In the dim light of the desk lamp, the torn edge of the diary glowed like a small wound. I closed the book carefully, as though it might break further. The pattern was there, waiting, but my understanding lagged behind like a man walking at dusk, who senses a figure following but dares not turn around. By the time Lewis brought me the photocopies, evening had already drawn the cloisters into their winter hush. The air smelled of damp ivy and the metallic tang of rain on stone. He laid the papers out like a conjurer, revealing cards. They showed transfers from the endowment fund into an account controlled by Dr. Sylvia March. Not large at first, then bolder, feeding a research project on some obscure neurological study that had stirred murmurs in the senior common room. Lewis's eyes had the steadiness of a man who believes he's found the answer at last. He said this was our motive. Kerridge discovers the diversion, threatens exposure, the acting warden silences him before midnight. It fitted so elegantly it made me uneasy. I had been taught by Oxford to distrust elegance. It often hides a crack. We walked to her office together, papers in hand. The corridor leading there creaked beneath our steps, exhaling that faint scent of polish and damp vellum. March received us without surprise, sitting very upright beneath a portrait of some long-dead benefactor. She listened while Lewis presented the figures. She said she had diverted the funds, yes, but openly, with the committee's tacit approval, and that Kerridge had known. Her voice was dry, amused, but her hands tightened slightly on the paper knife lying across her desk. She misquoted a line from Horace, perhaps habit, perhaps provocation, about virtue needing no disguise. I let the misquotation hang. Lewis pressed her on the timing. She replied with dates and memoranda, all correct, all bland. Nothing in her manner suggested a woman who had poisoned a bursar at midnight. When we left, she gave me a faintly ironic smile, as if she had expected better of my questions. Back in my rooms, the rain had settled into a steady whisper. I poured a small whiskey and left it untouched, spreading the papers across the desk. The figures formed a neat grid, each column aligning with the next like notes in a score. Yet the timing was wrong. The last transfer predated Kerridge's death by weeks. There was no urgency, no pressure point. If she had silenced him, it would have been months before, not at the stroke of midnight. On the far corner of my desk lay the visitor's book from the library, still open at the page of misquoted Haussmann. My pencil traced the faint diagonal slash beneath the entry. I had seen the same mark in the inn's register, the same rhythm in the bursary irregularities. 12s deferred, 12s doubled, a hush at 12. The pattern flickered again, not yet an answer but a cadence. I unfolded the crossword. Silent 12 remained blank, but now, staring at the numbers on the accounts and the torn diary page, a word trembled at the edge of recall. Not a solution yet, only a shadow. I smiled faintly despite myself. Patterns, like melodies, need patience to reveal their key. Outside, bells from Magdalen drifted across the damp night. The sound was muffled but precise, each chime a small incision in the dark. I felt the case shifting under me, the obvious motive draining away, leaving a more intricate shape. Dr. March might be guilty of many things, but not this. I closed the ledger and sat back, the whiskey still untouched. Rain tapped the window pane with a rhythm just off the beat of the bells. Somewhere within that dissonance, between a misquoted poet and a stopped watch, the truth waited. I would have to listen a little longer. Night had fallen over Oxford like a damp cloak when the fragments finally began to move toward each other. I sat at my desk with the diary open, the visitor's book beside it, and the crossword folded into quarters like a secret letter. Outside, the rain had thickened to a steady hiss against the window. Each droplet seemed to count something I could not yet name. I closed my eyes and reconstructed the evening of Kerridge's death, not as a timeline, but as a piece of music played too slowly. The chimes of St. Gabriel's clock tower had been silenced that week for maintenance. I remembered the notice pinned to the porter's board, a trivial slip of paper I had walked past twice without reading properly. With the tower mute, the college lay in a kind of temporal hush, as though it had stepped out of the ordinary sequence of hours. Kerridge, fastidious, would have relied on his father's old watch, the one he wound each morning as if feeding a small animal. What if he had adjusted it backward? The idea felt first like conjecture, then like inevitability. Kerridge, trying to mislead someone about his movements, perhaps to buy time, perhaps to set a trap, had unwittingly signaled his true killer. By placing himself at midnight on the paper, he had drawn them to him at the precise moment he was most alone. The thought came with a chill, not of triumph, but of belated recognition. I opened the visitor's book again. The misquoted Haussmann line stared back at me, altered in just the way Kerridge had once corrected in print. My pencil traced the first letters of each misquoted line down the page, like a man feeling for a pulse. They spelled out something rough but unmistakable. Crane. An acrostic hiding in plain sight, set like a stone in a wall no one thought to tap. It had been there all along, as obvious and as overlooked as the silenced bells. I poured a small measure of whiskey and held it without drinking. The liquid caught the desk lamp's glow, a muted amber. Margaret's face drifted through my mind, her careful explanations, her eyes sliding toward the cabinet. And with it, Fane's debts, March's diversions, each an elegant but false cadence. All of them had been my silent 12s, decoys on a score I had not yet learned to read. The crossword lay open. Silent 12 now yielded itself without resistance. Rest at noon. Not a word, but an instruction. A pause. It was the same pause Kerridge had tried to orchestrate, a silence that became its own confession. I penciled it in and closed the page, feeling the graphite smudge my thumb. Through the window the spires blurred in the rain. I thought of Crane upstairs in his shuttered room, copying out his notes with ink-stained fingers. I thought of Kerridge winding his father's watch, unaware he had already written his own summons. And I thought of myself, moving through the case like a man walking underwater, mishearing the tempo until the final bar. I did not yet know how to present it to Lewis. The evidence was still an arrangement of shadows, not a charge. But the pattern had emerged, faint and undeniable. The stopped watch, the silenced chimes, the misquoted poet spelling out a name. It did not feel like victory. It felt like arriving at a truth that had been waiting, patient and cold, for me to step into it. I set down the whiskey untouched and listened to the rain until the hour passed. Somewhere in the dark, the bells of another college struck, their sound carrying thin and distant across the city, like the echo of a decision already made. The dawn that morning was thin and colorless, a sketch rather than a painting. Mist lay low in the cloisters, drifting between the arches like the breath of an exhausted choir. My footsteps echoed faintly as I walked toward the far corner where Theo Crane waited. He stood with his back to a stone pillar, hands hidden in the folds of his coat, eyes fixed on the flagstones as though reading an inscription invisible to me. The smell of cold stone and wet ivy clung to the air. I spoke first, not loudly. I told him about the misquoted poet in the visitor's book, the marks in the inn's register, the silent chimes of St. Gabriel's. I said it was over, though in truth I was not certain what over meant in a place like this. He did not answer at once. A pigeon shifted above us, scattering dust from the ledge. When he finally raised his head, his face held the pale calm of someone who has rehearsed confession until it sounds like explanation. He said Kerridge had found him out. Years ago, as a desperate young tutor, he had taken a brilliant student's thesis and worked its ideas into his own paper. The student had gone abroad, obscure and uncredited. No one had questioned Crane's sudden rise. But Kerridge, with his ledgers and his habit of checking footnotes, had stumbled upon the ghost. Crane's voice cracked a little when he spoke the student's name, but the sound was swallowed by the mist. He said he had begged Kerridge for silence. Kerridge refused. The diary recorded their argument in careful detail. Crane had torn out the page and kept it, but its absence screamed louder than any entry could. He drew a folded scrap from his pocket, damp with his palm. The edges were jagged, the ink blurred, a single line of Kerridge's handwriting surviving. Watch ends. I asked about the port. He looked at me as if surprised that I knew. He said he had slipped a measured draught of poison into Kerridge's decanter, a preparation he had used once in fieldwork on rare fungi. Not enough to raise suspicion, time to mimic a heart failing at midnight. He had believed the college clock would mark the hour, but the chimes were silent for maintenance. Only Kerridge's watch, adjusted backward by his own hand, had fixed the time of death. Crane's voice faltered then. He said he had not meant to kill him that night, only to frighten him into delay. He had come back later, found Kerridge already gone, and in panic torn out the diary page. He spoke these things without drama, as if reading a list of items misplaced in a drawer. The mist thickened around us, softening the outlines of his coat, his face, even the pillar against which he leaned. I asked why he had left, the acrostic in the visitor's book. He gave a thin, almost shy smile. He said it was not meant as a clue, but as an indulgence, a private joke with himself, a way of writing his name without writing it. Only someone like Kerridge, or me, would notice. The bells of another college tolled faintly across the city, each chime dragging a small echo through the cloister. Crane's hands trembled slightly, then went still. He said nothing more. In that silence, I heard the crossword answer settling into place, a word both simple and irreversible. I did not arrest him there. We walked together back through the arches, his steps slow, mine slower. The smell of stone and rain seemed sharper than before. I thought of the student whose work had been stolen, of Kerridge's meticulous honesty, of Margaret's quiet eyes. The case had reached its conclusion, but like so many conclusions, it felt less like justice than the closing of a book one is not ready to finish. As we reached the gate, Crane paused, looking up at the grey sky. He whispered something I could not catch. Perhaps a line of poetry, perhaps nothing at all. I let it pass. Some words are meant to vanish into the mist. The college settled back into its facade of calm with the unconvincing ease of a stage set after the curtain falls. Porters straightened their caps. Students returned to their libraries. The chapel choir rehearsed an anthem whose notes drifted like pale smoke through the quadrangle. Crane was gone, taken quietly before breakfast, his rooms already stripped of the small tokens of scholarship he had arranged to look permanent. The cloisters smelled of polish again, but beneath it lingered a sour tang of disquiet, like damp in hidden wood. Lewis moved about briskly for a day or two, filing statements, exchanging dry remarks about paperwork, but he looked relieved in that unspoken way of men who prefer order to questions. I envied him his relief. For me, the case lay unfinished, not in fact, but in feeling. A puzzle completed, but with a piece pressed into place upside down. That afternoon, Margaret's note arrived. A single sheet on plain college stationery, folded once. She wrote that she hoped my work was concluded, that she was sorry for any misunderstanding, that she would be taking a sabbatical in Cambridge to catalogue a new collection. At the bottom, in handwriting smaller than the rest, she had added a line from Schubert, only half the phrase, left unresolved. I read it 3 times. It was polite, cool, yet hinted at some affection unspoken, like a chord that trembles but never resolves. I slipped the note into the pocket of my coat and walked without purpose until I reached the river. The air was damp and smelled of rotting leaves. The boathouse loomed ahead, its timbers darkened by rain, the brass lock dulled. Inside, oars lay stacked like old bones, a single pair of cracked shoes still crouched beneath the bench. The clock above the door remained as I had first seen it, hands stiff at 12, marking a time the world had already passed. I stood there a long while, listening to the muted lap of water against the stones. Across the chair well, students punted in silence, their poles sliding without splash. The sun had gone behind a low bank of cloud, leaving the sky the color of tarnished pewter. Everything in the scene seemed arrested, as if awaiting a signal. On the bench beside me lay my crossword, creased and stained. Silent 12 had long since yielded its answer, though I found no satisfaction in filling the square. It felt instead like a small act of burial. I traced the letters with my finger until they blurred. At length I reached up and adjusted the clock. The hands moved reluctantly, a faint grind of metal on metal until they showed the actual hour. It was a trivial gesture, but it steadied me. The tick resumed, hesitant at first, then sure. A watch without time had been given back its pulse. Margaret's note remained in my pocket, warming slightly with my body heat. I thought of her eyes drifting toward the locked cabinet, of her careful answers, of the music scores she might or might not have brought to Kerridge. Affection, like guilt, wears many disguises. Outside, the last punt slid under the bridge. Its lantern reflected twice in the dark water, then broken. Bells from another college began to toll the hour, their sound soft but precise, like a question answered too late. I closed my eyes and let the damp air settle on my face. Time, I thought, runs differently for those who wait.